When the sun dips below the horizon and the world grows dark, something deeply human happens to each of us. We begin to prepare for sleep. This ritual, this transition from wakefulness to rest, is perhaps one of the most universal experiences across all of human history. Yet, the way we approach this quiet time has changed dramatically over the centuries, shaped by the technology available to us, the fears that haunted particular eras, and the cultural beliefs that guided in our civilizations. Tonight, we're going to explore the quiet hours, those liminal spaces between day and night when people throughout history have engaged in rituals, both practical and spiritual, designed to ease their passage into sleep. We'll travel from ancient Egypt to Victorian England, from medieval monasteries to Japanese bedchambers, and witness how people have tried to create peace, comfort, and safety in the darkness. The history of sleep is, in many ways, the history of how humans have sought to control the uncontrollable. Darkness brings vulnerability. Night brings uncertainty. And so, across centuries and continents, people developed routines, superstitions, remedies, and practices, some scientific, some mystical, all of them deeply human, to help them navigate those hours of darkness with a sense of calm and protection. Before electricity reshaped our nights, before artificial light made perpetual day possible, the rhythm of sleep was dictated by the sun itself. Bedtime was not a choice but a necessity, governed by the availability of light and the practical demands of survival. Yet even within these constraints, people found ways to make the approaching night feel less frightening, more manageable, more bearable. As we move through this exploration, you'll discover that the anxiety many of us feel as we approach sleep, the racing thoughts, the small fears, the difficulty in transitioning from the stimulation of day to the emptiness of night, is not new. It is ancient. It is human. And throughout history, people have found ways to soothe these anxieties, to create rituals and practices that signal to both body and mind that it is time to let go, time to rest, time to surrender to sleep. So, let us dim the lights together and enter the quiet hours. Let us step back through time and witness how people in ages past prepared themselves for the night, how they spoke to one another in the darkness, how they sought safety and comfort as the world around them disappeared into shadow. In ancient Egypt, approximately 3,000 years ago, sleep was not viewed as a simple biological necessity or a time of peaceful rest. Rather, it was understood as a form of death, a temporary descent into the underworld from which one might, with proper precautions and the right intentions, return safely when morning came. This perspective profoundly shaped how Egyptians approached their bedtime routines. Sleep was something to be managed carefully, with rituals and protections put in place to ensure a safe journey through the night and a secure return to the world of the living and the light. As evening fell in ancient Egypt, as the heat of the day began to dissipate and the sky transformed into shades of purple and deep blue, families would gradually retreat indoors. Egyptian homes, designed to withstand the intense daytime heat, were often dark and cool by evening, naturally conducive to sleep, though not necessarily to the sense of security that people wanted as night approached. Before lying down to sleep, it was common for Egyptians to engage in what we might call a spiritual preparation. They would recite specific prayers and invocations designed to protect them during their night's journey. These were not the casual good night wishes of modern times, but rather deliberate magical formulas intended to safeguard the soul, the K, during its vulnerable hours of sleep. One of the most popular protective devices was the scarab amulet. Egyptians would often keep these carved beetles near their beds or wear them close to their bodies. The scarab represented transformation and renewal, the sun's journey through the underworld and its rebirth at dawn. By keeping a scarab close during sleep, one was, in a sense, ensuring that the cycle of rebirth would continue, that dawn would come, that one would wake again. The walls of Egyptian bedchambers were sometimes inscribed with protective spells and invocations to various gods. Sleeping in such a room was like resting inside a fortress of divine protection, surrounded by words and images of power. Even for those who could not afford such elaborate decorations, the knowledge that such spells existed, that others were sleeping surrounded by these protections, created a sense of communal safety. Temperature and comfort played roles as well. The wealthy used linen sheets, a luxury in the ancient world, which absorbed sweat and provided a cool, comfortable surface on which to rest. These were often dyed in soft colors that were associated with calm and peace. Pillows, when used, were typically made of wood, stone, or ceramic, and were often carved into the shapes of animals or decorated with protective imagery. While these might not seem comfortable to our modern sensibilities, they served a purpose beyond mere physical support. They were objects of intention and meaning. Essential oils and perfumes were frequently used in Egyptian bedtime preparations. Oils made from frankincense, myrrh, and other aromatic plants were applied to the body or placed in small vessels near the bed. These scents served multiple purposes. They masked the often unpleasant odors of daily life before modern plumbing. They had genuine calming properties, and they were associated with the divine. The use of fragrance transformed the act of going to bed into something almost ceremonial. Music, too, played a role. In wealthy households, musicians might play soft, gentle melodies as evening approached. Simple instruments like harps and lyres, producing sounds that encouraged the mind to slow and settle. The rhythmic quality of certain musical patterns was understood, even then, to have a soothing effect on the nervous system. Yet, despite all these precautions and protections, the night still brought fear. Egyptians believed in the existence of demons and malevolent spirits that roamed during darkness. One such entity was Sekhmet, a fiercest goddess associated with plague and misfortune, though she could also be appeased and turned toward protection. Another was Apophis, a serpent of chaos that threatened the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld. To protect against these threats, Egyptians would often sleep with amulets nearby. Not just scarabs, but also the Eye of Horus, which represented wholeness and divine protection, or the Ankh, the symbol of life itself. Some would place iron objects near their beds, believing that iron had protective properties against spiritual threats. Others kept iron tools under their pillows, specifically for this reason. For those who experienced particularly restless nights or troubling dreams, there were remedies. A mixture of plant seeds, including poppy seeds, which contain natural sleep-inducing compounds, might be dissolved in warm water or milk and consumed before bed. This was not accidental medicine. The Egyptians understood through observation and experience that certain substances had the power to deepen sleep and reduce anxiety. Dreams themselves were taken very seriously. Upon waking, Egyptians would often record and interpret their dreams. sometimes in journals or on papyrus. This practice served to process anxieties and to divine meaning from the night's experiences. If a dream was particularly troubling, the dreamer might consult a priest or a wise person to help interpret its meaning and determine if additional protective measures were needed. The Egyptians, living in a civilization where the Nile's flooding patterns determined the rhythms of life and death, where divine order maintained the cosmos against chaos, understood that sleep required intention. Bedtime was not something that simply happened. It was something one actively prepared for, something one ritualized and protected. And perhaps because of this intentional approach, Egyptians developed a sophistication in understanding sleep that lasted thousands of years. In the Roman Empire, as civilization grew more complex and urban life became the norm for an increasing number of people, sleep became something that many found difficult to achieve. The irony is striking. In a time when artificial light was limited to oil lamps and candles, people nonetheless struggled with insomnia, and Roman physicians and philosophers developed extensive theories about why. The Roman approach to sleep was rooted in the principle of balance, a concept that permeated all aspects of their philosophy and medicine. Health, according to the Roman physician Galen, who lived in the 2nd century CE, was a state of equilibrium between opposing forces, hot and cold, wet and dry, and various humors within the body. Sleep, he theorized, was the result of a harmonious balance of these elements, and insomnia arose when this balance was disrupted. As evening approached in a Roman home, particularly in the homes of the wealthy, there was often a gradual dimming of activity. Dinner, the main meal of the day, was typically eaten in the late afternoon or early evening. This meal would be followed by a period of relaxation and conversation. After the intensity of the day, the business dealings, the political discussions, the social obligations, Romans understood that the body and mind needed time to transition toward rest. For those suffering from insomnia, which was a recognized and discussed problem among Roman writers and physicians, several remedies were available. Pliny the Elder, the famous naturalist, documented numerous treatments in his encyclopedic natural history. One recommendation was to drink a warm infusion of herbs, chamomile, for instance, which was known to have a calming effect. Another was to consume milk, which was understood to have cooling and soothing properties. Some recommended the consumption of poppy seeds in wine, building on knowledge that had been passed down from Egypt and earlier civilizations. Beyond herbal remedies, behavioral modifications were also prescribed. Physicians recommended avoiding heavy meals close to bedtime, as digestion was believed to create internal heat and agitation. They recommended against excessive sexual activity in the evening, as this was thought to deplete vital energy. They advised against reading or engaging in intense mental activity close to bedtime. These recommendations show a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between mental activity and sleep quality. The physical environment of sleep was carefully considered. Bedrooms in wealthier Roman homes were designed with ventilation in mind. Windows were positioned to catch cooling breezes in the evening and night. Beds themselves were often elevated on wooden frames, which provided both comfort and practical protection from floor-dwelling insects and rodents. Bedding was made from linen or wool, depending on the season. Linen for warmth and wool for the cooler months. The Romans understood that temperature regulation was crucial to comfort. A common bedtime practice was to take a warm bath, or at least to wash the feet and hands in warm water. This was understood to relax the body and to prepare it for sleep. The warmth of the water would then gradually dissipate, and as the body temperature cooled afterward, this cooling was thought to facilitate the onset of sleep. Some Roman authors recommended adding certain herbs or flower essences to bathwater to enhance its relaxing properties. Massage was another popular bedtime practice among those who could afford it. A slave or family member might massage the tired limbs with fragrant oils infused with lavender, rose, or other calming plants. This combination of touch, warmth, and fragrance was believed to ease muscular tension and mental anxiety. The practice also served a social function, strengthening bonds between family members or between a master and servant. Yet despite these knowledge and practices, many Romans still struggled with sleeplessness. Insomnia was not seen as a moral failing or a sign of weakness, but rather as a medical condition requiring treatment. Some of the wealthy would consult physicians who might recommend travel to warmer climates, changes in diet, or the use of specific medications. Others sought solace in philosophy. The Stoic philosophers, in particular, developed practices for managing the anxieties that kept one awake. These practices involved contemplating the impermanence of life, the futility of worry about things beyond one's control, and the importance of accepting what cannot be changed. Before bed, a Stoic might engage in a period of meditation and reflection, reviewing the day's events and consciously letting go of regrets and anxieties. This is not unlike modern cognitive behavioral approaches to insomnia. For those of lower social status, sleep in Roman cities could be even more difficult to achieve. Many lived in tall apartment buildings called insula, which were notorious for noise, heat, and crowding. Sleep might be interrupted by neighbors, by street noise, by heat radiating from inadequate ventilation. In these circumstances, people relied on community, on familial bonds, and on shared acceptance of the difficulty. Children would sleep close to parents or other family members, creating warmth and a sense of security. One interesting aspect of Roman sleep culture was the practice of the siesta, the afternoon rest that remains common in Mediterranean regions. Romans understood that if nighttime sleep was difficult or inadequate, a brief rest in the afternoon could restore balance and allow one to function adequately through the evening. This practice was particularly common among the elderly and among those engaged in physical labor. The Romans also recognized that the mind itself could be an obstacle to sleep. Worrying thoughts, anticipation of future challenges, rumination about past failures, all of these were understood to interfere with rest. Philosophers and physicians alike recommended mental techniques to address this. One practice was to focus the mind intently on a single calming image or idea, allowing other thoughts to fade away. Another was to engage in rhythmic breathing, a practice that would later be formalized in meditation traditions, but was already understood by Romans to have a calming effect. As night deepened in Roman cities, night watchmen would patrol the streets, calling out the hours and confirming that all was well. These calls served a practical purpose, warning of fire or other dangers, but they also provided a sense of reassurance. Even in sleep, one was not entirely alone. Beyond the darkness of the bedroom, society continued its careful watch, and the Roman approach to sleep then was multifaceted, medical, philosophical, and practical all at once. It was rooted in an understanding of the body as a system requiring balance. the mind as something requiring calming, and the social environment as something contributing to individual well-being. When a Roman lay down to sleep, they were engaging not just in a biological function, but in a carefully considered practice aimed at health and harmony. The fall of the Roman Empire and the transition into the medieval period brought profound changes to how Europeans approached sleep and the night. Without the infrastructure, technology, or urban sophistication of Rome, medieval people existed in a world that was darker, more dangerous, and more spiritually charged than anything the Romans had experienced. In medieval Europe, darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was the absence of God's visible presence. The night was the domain of evil, of demons, of spiritual danger. This was not superstition, but sincere theological understanding shared by the educated and uneducated alike. As night fell, people understood that they were entering a time of heightened spiritual vulnerability, when the demonic realm held particular power. The structure of medieval sleep itself was fundamentally different from what we experience today. For most medieval people, sleep was segmented. They did not sleep for a continuous 8-hour block, as modern conventions suggest. Instead, they might sleep for a few hours after evening, wake in the middle of the night for a period of an hour or two, and then return to sleep. This pattern, which historians call biphasic sleep or segmented sleep, allowed time for prayer, contemplation, sexual intimacy between spouses, or simply lying in bed and thinking. This biphasic rhythm aligned with the structure of the Church's prayer cycle. Monks and nuns would rise in the deep night for the service of matins, and devout lay people often used this waking period to say prayers or to recite devotional texts. The night vigil was not seen as a disruption of sleep, but as a natural rhythm that allowed for both physical rest and spiritual practice. As evening approached in a medieval household, preparation for sleep took on a distinctly spiritual character. A family might gather to say prayers together, asking for divine protection during the night. These prayers were not merely requests for safety, though they certainly included that element. They were also expressions of submission to God's will and acceptance of the possibility that one might not wake at all. Medieval people understood that death could come at any moment, and sleep was understood as a rehearsal of death, a brief surrender to the unknown. The bedroom itself was often a room shared by the entire household or extended family, or at minimum by parents and children. Beds might have curtains or drapes around them, not for privacy, as privacy was not a valued commodity in medieval life, but for warmth. The heavy fabric of bed curtains would trap body heat and create a small protected microclimate within the larger unheated room. The bedding in medieval homes varied greatly depending on social status. The poor might sleep on straw mattresses with rough blankets. Wealthier people would have feather beds, a luxury item that provided much greater comfort. The difference in comfort was not merely a matter of material comfort. It was a manifestation of social hierarchy, and as such, bedding was often mentioned specifically in wills and inventories as a valuable possession. Before lying down, medieval people might engage in specific rituals. Some would wash their faces or their hands and feet in cold water, viewing this as a form of spiritual purification as well as practical hygiene. Others would anoint themselves with holy water or oil, placing a small cross on the forehead or over the heart. These actions connected the intimate physical act of preparing for sleep with spiritual intention and protection. Nighttime prayers in medieval Europe often focused on protection. A popular prayer went, "God be in my head and in my understanding. God be in mine eyes and in my looking. God be in my mouth and in my speaking. God be in my heart and in my thinking. God be at mine end and at my departing." This prayer, which appears in various forms throughout medieval Europe, shows a preoccupation with ensuring that God's presence extended into the vulnerability of sleep. Other prayers were specifically designed to prevent nightmares or demonic visitation. These prayers would invoke saints, particularly Saint Michael the Archangel, whose role was to battle demonic forces. The medieval person drifting off to sleep might be repeating a prayer to Saint Michael, imagining the great warrior angel standing guard at the threshold of sleep, preventing harmful spirits from approaching. Superstitions and folk practices abounded. Some people would place a knife under the bed to ward off evil spirits. Others would scatter salt or herbs with purifying properties on the floor around the bed. In some regions, people believed that leaving shoes arranged in a specific pattern was protective. These practices seem strange to the modern mind, but they served a genuine psychological purpose. They created a sense of agency and control in a situation, approaching sleep in the dark, that was inherently anxiety-provoking. Medieval literature and records reveal that sleep disturbances were common and often attributed to spiritual causes. A person suffering from nightmares might be believed to be under attack by demons or to be receiving a message from God. Those who experienced persistent insomnia might be thought to be suffering from a form of spiritual possession or punishment for sin. The solutions, then, were often spiritual in nature. Increased prayer, confession, the wearing of religious relics, or consultation with a priest or bishop. However, medieval medicine, influenced by the classical theories of Galen and Hippocrates, also recognized a physical component to sleep disturbances. Imbalances in the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were thought to cause insomnia. A person with an excess of choler, yellow bile, might be hot and anxious, and therefore unable to sleep. The prescription would be cooling and calming, achieved through diet, herbs, or bloodletting to reduce excess humor. Herbal remedies were certainly used. Preparations containing valerian, hops, and other sleep-inducing plants were available. Some were created by apothecaries and sold in markets. Others were made at home using knowledge passed down through generations. Wine infused with these herbs would be taken warm before bed. The combination of warmth, alcohol, and medicinal herbs would help ease the transition into sleep. For those of the monastic life, sleep was highly structured and closely monitored. Monks slept in a dormitory, often in a common room with many others, where silence was maintained and where the sleep period was strictly limited. The rule of Saint Benedict, which established the basic principles governing most monasteries, specified that monks should receive adequate rest, but that sleep should not be indulged in excessively. The bell would ring for the night office, the church service of matins, well before dawn, waking everyone to prayer. Returning to sleep afterward was often difficult, and some monks would struggle with drowsiness during the early morning services. Nuns, similarly, maintained a rigorous sleep schedule. The idea was not that sleep was somehow sinful or should be eliminated, but that it should be carefully balanced with other spiritual and practical activities. Too much sleep was seen as sloth, one of the deadly sins. But sleeping too little was also problematic. It could lead to irritability and spiritual struggles. For lay people, the situation was different. Farmers and laborers worked according to the seasons and the agricultural cycle. In winter, when daylight was brief and work outdoors was minimal, people would retire to sleep earlier and wake later. In summer, when daylight extended into the evening and work continued almost until dark, sleep might be delayed. This natural fluctuation with the seasons was the normal rhythm of life. Children in medieval households would typically sleep with parents or other family members, providing warmth and creating a sense of security. The vulnerability of childhood sleep was taken seriously, and protective measures would be extra vigilant around the beds of children. Prayers would be said over them, and they might be made to wear amulets or blessed objects. The experience of medieval sleep was in many ways a collective experience. In crowded homes with multiple family members, in monasteries with communal dormitories, even in poorhouses where the destitute slept in shared rooms. Sleep was not a solitary private act. It was something experienced in proximity to others, with all the comfort and the intrusion that such proximity implies. The sound of another person's breathing could be reassuring, but it could also be distracting. The warmth of a family member could provide necessary physical heat, but it could also create discomfort. Sleep was navigated within a social context in a way that is difficult for modern people, accustomed to solitude, to fully comprehend. As Europe emerged from the medieval period into the Renaissance and early modern era, attitudes towards sleep began to shift. The rise of natural philosophy, what we would now call science, created new frameworks for understanding sleep. Even as old superstitions persisted, this was a period of transition, where ancient authority was questioned, where observation and experiment were beginning to replace received wisdom, and where new anxieties, born of social and intellectual change, began to disturb people's rest. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, meant that ideas, both new discoveries and old authorities, could be disseminated far more widely than before. Physicians could now read the works of other physicians across Europe. Different medical traditions could be compared and debated. This democratization of knowledge, paradoxically, also created more confusion. Where medieval people might have accepted a single authority, the local priest or the local physician, early modern people were increasingly exposed to conflicting opinions and had to navigate multiple sources of medical and spiritual advice. Theories of sleep continued to be rooted in the humoral model, but increasingly, natural philosophers were beginning to question and refine these theories. The observation that sleep could be induced by certain substances, poppy, mandrake, and hemlock, led to investigations into how these substances affected the body. Though the mechanisms were not yet understood, it was becoming clear that sleep was not merely a spiritual state, but a physical phenomenon that could be influenced by physical means. The beds of early modern Europe, at least among the wealthier classes, began to change. The four-poster bed with curtains became more common. These were not merely pieces of furniture, but significant investments, often included specifically in wills and inherited by successive generations. The purpose of the curtains was still partially practical, to retain heat, but they also served to create a private space within a shared room, a small world of one's own where one could retreat into sleep. Bedding became increasingly varied and refined. Different materials were used for different seasons. Linen sheets were washed more frequently among the upper classes, as cleanliness began to be more highly valued. Down pillows and feather beds became more common, and their softness and insulating properties were greatly appreciated. For those who could afford it, the bed became a place of genuine comfort, a stark contrast to the hard surfaces of medieval bedding. Yet the comfort of beds did not necessarily translate to better sleep. If anything, this period saw increased discussion of sleep difficulties, particularly among the educated classes and the wealthy. Why should this be? Part of the explanation may be that as life became more complex, as business dealings became more intricate, as social obligations multiplied, the mind became busier. Worries about financial matters, about health, about reputation, about the rapidly changing world could all keep one awake at night. The physician Thomas Sydenham, living in the late 17th century, wrote extensively about insomnia and offered both medical and philosophical advice. He recommended the maintenance of regular schedules, going to bed at the same time each night and waking at the same time each morning. He advised against excessive mental exertion before bed. He recommended physical exercise during the day, but not too close to bedtime. He suggested avoiding heavy meals. These recommendations, made in the 17th century, sound remarkably modern and would not be out of place in a contemporary sleep hygiene guide. Sydenham also recognized that for many insomniacs, the anxiety about sleep itself became an impediment. A person who lay awake worrying about whether they would fall asleep was far less likely to sleep than someone who could accept their wakefulness with equanimity. This psychological insight, that anxiety about sleep was itself a cause of insomnia, would not be formally incorporated into medical understanding for several more centuries. But Sydenham clearly grasped it. Bedtime remedies in the early modern period were numerous and varied. Warm milk remained popular. Herbal infusions continued to be used. Some recommended reading before bed, not intense intellectual works, but gentle literature designed to calm the mind. Others recommended music. The idea was that certain musical compositions could tune the mind toward rest, much as a musical instrument must be tuned to produce proper notes. Some suggested that the mind should be focused on pleasant, calming images. A meadow, a stream, a beloved face, and that by maintaining this mental focus, sleep would come. For those who could afford to employ servants, having someone present in the bedroom, perhaps seated beside the bed or nearby, was not uncommon. This person's role was partly practical. They might tend to needs during the night, but partly psychological. The presence of another human being provided a sense of security and companionship. For those of lower social status, sleeping in proximity to family members served the same function. Religious practice continued to play a role in bedtime routines. Prayers were still said, and Bible reading or devotional texts were common bedtime activities. However, the nature of faith was beginning to change. The Protestant Reformation, which began in the early 16th century, shifted how people understood their relationship with the divine. Instead of relying on the Church's rituals and mediation, Protestant theology emphasized individual faith and personal prayer. This meant that bedtime prayers became more individualized, more personal, less dependent on prescribed ecclesiastical formulas. Yet this period also saw an increase in anxiety about sleep itself, or rather, about what occurred during sleep. The development of witchcraft theories, which reached their height in the 17th century, created new fears. Some people believed that during sleep, one's spirit or soul could be drawn away by witches or demons. Nightmares were interpreted not as mere mental phenomena, but as actual encounters with malevolent beings. The confusion and vivid imagery of nightmares seemed to confirm that something real was happening, that one was genuinely vulnerable during sleep. To protect against witchcraft or demonic visitation, people employed various measures. They might sleep with protective amulets, crosses, herbs like St. John's wort, or stones believed to have protective powers. Some would place iron, a metal traditionally thought to have apotropaic properties, under the bed. Others would recite protective incantations or prayers, specifically designed to create a barrier against spiritual intrusion. The early modern period was also a time when artificial lighting was gradually improving. Oil lamps became more refined and burned more brightly. Candles made from tallow or, for the wealthy, from beeswax were more readily available. This meant that the onset of darkness and the need to sleep were no longer so absolutely dictated by the setting of the sun. Artificial light extended the active day. And for some, this was a relief. There was more time to work or socialize. For others, it was a source of anxiety. The ability to extend the day artificially seemed to violate natural rhythms, and some believed this disruption contributed to sleep difficulties. The 18th century, known as the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, brought a fundamental shift in how educated people understood the world, including sleep. The advances in natural philosophy and the beginnings of a more rigorous scientific method meant that sleep began to be studied as a natural phenomenon rather than primarily as a spiritual or moral matter. The microscope and telescope had revealed vast new territories of reality. Chemistry was emerging as a discipline. Anatomy was being studied more rigorously. In this context, questions about sleep became scientific questions. What happens to the body during sleep? Why do we need sleep? What is the mechanism by which herbal remedies promote sleep? The physician and anatomist Herman Boerhaave, based in the Dutch city of Leiden, became influential across Europe through his writings and through students who came from far and wide to study with him. Boerhaave taught that sleep was a physiological state in which the sensory nerves were relaxed and the movement of blood to the head was reduced. This was still rooted in outdated theory. We know now that blood flow to the brain actually increases during certain stages of sleep, but it represented an attempt to explain sleep in mechanical, physical terms. Boerhaave and his contemporaries began to classify the various causes of insomnia and to develop more systematic approaches to treatment. They distinguished between insomnia caused by physical factors, pain, discomfort, hunger, and that caused by mental factors, worry, excitement, an overactive mind. This differentiation allowed for more targeted treatments. For physical causes, the recommendations were relatively straightforward. Ensure comfort, maintain appropriate temperature, address any underlying physical ailments. For mental causes, the approach was to calm and quiet the mind. Physicians recommended avoiding intense intellectual activity before bed. They recommended avoiding stimulating social interactions. They suggested that the bedroom should be a quiet refuge, separated from the bustle of the household. They recommended maintaining regular sleep schedules so that the body would become accustomed to sleeping at particular times. Some physicians in this period became increasingly skeptical of the magical and superstitious elements of bedtime practice. They were less likely to recommend amulets or protective charms, viewing these as relics of ignorance. However, they did not necessarily dismiss the psychological benefit of such objects. If a person felt safer with an amulet under the pillow, then that sense of safety might genuinely facilitate sleep. The mechanism might not be magical, but the effect could be real. Herbal remedies continued to be used, but there was more interest in understanding how they worked. Poppy was known to induce sleep, though its use was associated with increasing dependence and various health problems if used chronically. Valerian, passion flower, and hops were recognized as having calming properties. The doses and preparations of these herbs were becoming more standardized, moving toward what we might recognize as early pharmacology. One fascinating development in the 18th century was the interest in hydropathy, the therapeutic use of water. Some physicians believed that cold water immersion or bathing had a beneficial effect on the nerves and could help promote sleep. Others recommended warm baths, arguing that the warmth would relax the muscles and calm the mind. Bathing became not just a matter of cleanliness, but a therapeutic practice prescribed for various ailments, including insomnia. The architecture of homes, particularly among the growing middle class, was beginning to change in ways that affected sleep. The concept of separate bedrooms, not just sleeping spaces carved out of multi-purpose rooms, but actual rooms dedicated to sleeping, was becoming more common and more feasible as houses became larger and wealthier families had more space to allocate. The bedroom, as a distinct room with a door that could close, began to emerge as a concept. This had implications for how sleep was experienced. A private bedroom meant privacy not just from the wider world, but from family members. It meant the ability to control light and temperature more completely. It meant freedom from the disturbances of others' movements and sleep cycles. For those privileged enough to have access to such private spaces, sleep could be experienced differently, more reliably, more comfortably, with fewer interruptions. Yet paradoxically, for some people, this privacy brought its own anxieties. A person sleeping alone in a room was more vulnerable than one sleeping in proximity to others. Noises that would previously have been heard by multiple people, a creak in the floorboards, a sound outside the window, were now experienced alone, without the reassurance of others' presence. This might explain why some insomniacs of the period reported that they slept better when someone else was present in the room, even if that person was doing nothing actively to help them sleep. The scientific study of dreams also began to develop in this period. While dreams had always been of interest, they had been interpreted religiously, medically, and philosophically. The 18th century saw attempts to catalogue and understand dreams more systematically. Some physicians believed that dreams reflected the state of the body's humours. Others thought that dreams were the mind's way of processing experiences from the waking day. Still others were beginning to suspect that dreams might provide insights into the workings of the mind. Bedtime preparation in a middle-class household of the 18th century would have included many elements we would recognize today. A person might bathe or wash before bed. They might change into nightclothes, soft, comfortable garments designed for sleep, rather than the daytime clothes of previous centuries. They might read something calming. They might drink something warm. They might engage in a period of prayer or reflection. They might ensure that the bedroom was at a comfortable temperature and free from excessive noise. Yet this was also a period of rapid social change. The development of manufacturing and trade, the growth of cities, the increasing pace of commercial life, All of these meant that for many people, particularly those involved in business or professional pursuits, the mind was often preoccupied with financial and practical concerns. The stress of this increasingly complex world was manifest in sleep difficulties. Medical texts of the period discuss insomnia as a particular problem among merchants, lawyers, and physicians, those engaged in demanding intellectual and commercial work. The solution, from the 18th century physician's perspective, was to find ways to quiet and occupy the mind. Reading was recommended, but the choice of material was important. Dry, repetitive, or mildly tedious reading was considered ideal. It would engage the mind enough to prevent it from wandering into anxious thoughts, but not so much as to stimulate and excite it. Poetry of a gentle, contemplative sort was considered ideal. Religious texts could be calming, though one's religious texts should be familiar and comforting rather than challenging or controversial, as intellectual disagreement or uncertainty would provoke wakefulness. Some physicians of the period recommended journaling, writing down the day's events and one's thoughts about them before bed. The act of externalizing these concerns onto paper was thought to free the mind from carrying them into sleep. This practice, used formally in therapeutic contexts in the modern era, was thus anticipated by 18th century doctors. The increasing availability of artificial light through improved candles and lamps meant that the boundary between day and night was becoming more permeable. For those who could afford it, the evening was no longer a necessary time for sleep. One could read, work, socialize, and conduct business by candlelight or lamplight. This created more flexibility in daily schedules. But it also meant that the natural rhythm of sleep, aligned with the sun's rising and setting, was disrupted. Some people found this liberating. Others found that it disrupted their sleep patterns and caused difficulty. The 19th century witnessed the most profound disruptions to sleep patterns that had occurred since the development of agriculture and civilization itself. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain and spreading throughout Europe and eventually the world, transformed work, time, and human existence. Gaslighting was introduced in cities, extending the productive day far into the night. Factories operated on schedules determined by economic efficiency rather than natural rhythms. Railroad networks connected distant places and created new time zones and scheduling demands. For workers in factories, sleep became fragmented and inadequate. The factory whistle would call workers to labor before dawn. Work would continue through long days and sometimes into the evening. The exhaustion was profound. The diseases associated with overwork, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and others, were epidemic. Sleep, which should have been restorative, was often too brief and too disrupted by the hardship of daily life to provide genuine rest. For those who worked in mills and factories, the bedroom was often cramped and shared. Multiple family members might sleep in a single room, or workers might rent beds in shifts. One person sleeping while the other worked, then exchanging places. Cleanliness was difficult to maintain. The air was often thick with coal smoke and industrial pollution. Windows were kept closed to maintain heat, so air quality suffered. The conditions for sleep were poor, and sleep difficulties were widespread. Yet the 19th century also saw improvements for some. The middle class was expanding, and with it came the possibility of greater comfort and privacy. Gas lighting meant that homes could be well lit, creating an extension of the productive and social day. For those with the means, Bedrooms became increasingly defined as spaces dedicated to sleep and privacy, with doors that locked and with a level of separation from the rest of the household that had previously been rare. The Victorian era, the period of Queen Victoria's reign in Britain, 1837 to 1901, saw particular attention paid to creating a proper bedroom environment and bedtime routine. The Victorian bedroom was considered an important space, and significant resources were devoted to its decoration and furnishing. Heavy curtains and drapes were used to block out light. Important as gas lamps and increasingly electric lights were brightening city streets at night. Carpeting provided insulation and sound dampening. Beds became increasingly elaborate, with elaborate headboards and footboards, intricate bed frames, and abundant pillows and cushions. The Victorian bedtime ritual became quite elaborate, particularly among the upper and middle classes. For women, this often involved an extended process of undressing and removing the day's restrictive garments, corsets, layers of skirts and petticoats. This process itself might be experienced as relief, as the body was finally freed from constraint. Night clothes would be changed into typically long flannel or linen gowns, designed for modesty as well as warmth. For men, the Victorian bedtime might include the reading of literature, newspapers, or devotional texts by lamplight. Some would sit and reflect on the day. Pipes and cigars might be smoked. Conversations between spouses might occur. As artificial lighting became more available, bedtime became less tied to darkness and more tied to the decision to retire. A social and personal choice rather than an inevitable consequence of sunset. The rise of medical science in the 19th century brought new frameworks for understanding sleep. Sleep was increasingly understood in terms of medical science rather than philosophy or spirituality. The nervous system was a particular focus of study. Insomnia was sometimes classified as a nervous disorder, a malfunction or exhaustion of the nervous system. Treatment might involve rest cures, in which patients, particularly middle and upper class women, would be prescribed a period of bed rest, isolation, and sometimes medical treatment. One of the most famous advocates of the rest cure was the American neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell. He prescribed complete bed rest, combined with good nutrition, massage, and isolation from the stresses of daily life, for patients suffering from what was sometimes called neurasthenia, a condition characterized by fatigue, anxiety, and various physical symptoms that modern medicine would likely classify as depression or an anxiety disorder. Mitchell's approach, while sometimes extreme in its application, was rooted in a legitimate observation that exhaustion and stress could indeed be improved through rest, nourishment, and a removal from the sources of stress. However, the rest cure, as applied to women in particular, was also a mechanism of control. Women who were deemed to be suffering from nervousness could be confined to bed, often separated from their families and their normal activities, and subjected to medical treatments that might include morphine injections or other drugs. While some women undoubtedly benefited from genuine rest, others found the experience confining and potentially harmful. The 19th century also saw the emergence of a scientific interest in dreams. Scientists like Alfred Maury and others conducted experiments on dreams, trying to understand their causes and their nature. Maury famously documented that dreams occurred in an extended sequence, often in the few moments before waking, contradicting the common assumption that dreams lasted throughout the night. This was an important discovery though the mechanisms of sleep and dreaming would not be fully understood until much later. Hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, the states of half-sleep between waking and sleeping, became of particular interest. These states, in which consciousness is altered but not fully asleep, seem to offer insights into how the mind functioned. Some people reported unusual sensations, vivid imagery, or even auditory hallucinations during these states. For some, these experiences were fascinating. For others, they were frightening, and they contributed to anxiety about sleep itself. The late 19th century saw the emergence of new drugs that could induce sleep. Chlorohydrate, introduced in 1869, was one of the first synthetic sleep-inducing medications. It was widely used, sometimes under the name knockout drops, and became popular both as a therapeutic agent and as a tool for crime. It could be slipped into someone's drink without their knowledge. Barbiturates, developed in the early 20th century, would later become even more widespread. The availability of these powerful medications raised questions about the nature of sleep. If sleep could be induced artificially by a chemical, what did that say about sleep as a natural process? Did the sleep induced by chloral hydrate provide genuine rest and restoration? Or was it merely a temporary loss of consciousness? These questions troubled physicians and philosophers. For many 19th century people, particularly in cities, the night was becoming less a time of darkness and more a time of altered light. Gas lamps lit streets and public spaces. Well-to-do homes had gas lighting in multiple rooms. The night sky, increasingly obscured by light pollution, was less starlit and more pallid. For children and others accustomed to sleeping in darkness, this transition to nights that were never entirely dark represented a significant change in the sleep environment. The invention of the railroad created a particular challenge for sleep and rest. Trains traveled at high speeds, stopping only at stations. Passengers often slept on trains, sometimes for hours or days. The constant motion, the noise, the uncomfortable seats, these conditions made genuine sleep difficult. Yet, people adapted. The development of sleeping cars, compartments with beds specifically designed for overnight travel, represents an early example of human ingenuity in creating adequate sleep environments in difficult circumstances. As the 19th century transitioned into the 20th, electricity became increasingly common in homes, at least in developed countries and urban areas. Electric lighting was brighter, more reliable, and could be turned on and off at will with a simple switch. This represented a radical transformation in the human relationship with light and darkness, and by extension, with sleep. For the first time in human history, the night could be made as bright as the day. The sun's setting no longer required human activity to cease. Work could continue. Social interactions could persist. Leisure activities could be enjoyed in artificial light. The natural rhythm of sleep and wakefulness, which had governed human life since the beginning of civilization, was suddenly optional. The implications of this were profound and not immediately apparent. At first, electric lighting seemed purely beneficial. No longer would people be bound by the constraints of darkness. No longer would evenings be limited to the handful of activities possible by candlelight or gaslight. The electric light seemed to promise liberation from the tyranny of night. Yet, within a few decades, the consequences began to become apparent. Surveys of sleep in the early 20th century compared to the 19th century, suggested that average sleep duration had decreased. People were going to bed later, as electric lighting made evening activities more appealing and more convenient. They were waking earlier, as the artificial dawn of electric lights in urban areas lightened the bedroom before the sun rose. Perhaps more significantly, the nature of evening activities had changed. Where the 19th century evening might have involved quiet family activities, reading or conversation, activities that were relatively calming and that naturally led towards sleep. The 20th century evening increasingly involved activities that stimulated rather than calmed. Electric lights could be bright and harsh. Radios and later televisions provided entertainment and news that could be exciting or disturbing. The technology that was supposed to liberate people from the constraints of the night instead seemed to fragment and disrupt it. Yet, at the same time, the 20th century also saw improvements in sleep environments for many people. Bedrooms became more common as private spaces. Beds became more comfortable. The science of sleep was advancing. Psychoanalysis, developed by Sigmund Freud and others, created new frameworks for understanding dreams and their significance. Sleep and dreams were no longer merely physical phenomena. They were windows into the unconscious mind. In the mid-20th century, significant discoveries about sleep were made. The invention of electroencephalography, the ability to measure electrical activity in the brain, allowed researchers to study what was actually happening during sleep. The discovery of remedation, rapid eye movement, sleep, and its association with dreams, represented a major breakthrough. Suddenly, sleep could be measured and observed in ways that were previously impossible. These discoveries led to new classifications of sleep problems. Insomnia was distinguished from other sleep disorders, such as sleep apnea or narcolepsy. The architecture of sleep, the pattern of different sleep stages and their relationship to one another, began to be understood. This scientific knowledge, while valuable, also contributed to a new form of anxiety, the worry that one's sleep was not following the proper pattern, that one's sleep was abnormal or inadequate. For the average person, however, bedtime routines in the 20th century varied widely. In rural areas and in developing countries, sleep continued to be governed more by traditional patterns and natural light-dark cycles. In urban areas of developed countries, sleep was increasingly under voluntary control, something that could be manipulated by one's schedule, by one's choice of evening activities, and by increasingly available medications. The mid to late 20th century saw the emergence of sleeping pills as a routine solution to insomnia. Barbiturates, which had been available since early in the century, became increasingly prescribed. Later, benzodiazepines were introduced and widely used. These medications were effective in inducing sleep, but they came with risks, including dependence, side effects, and the possibility of dangerous interactions with alcohol or other substances. Despite the availability of these medications, many people still preferred non-pharmaceutical approaches to sleep. Bedtime routines remained important. A warm glass of milk or chamomile tea before bed was still a common practice. The routine of changing clothes, brushing teeth, and preparing the bedroom for sleep persisted. Reading before bed remained popular. For many, these rituals seemed to have a genuine calming effect that no medication could replicate. The development of air conditioning in the mid-20th century changed the sleep environment for those who could afford it. For the first time, it became possible to reliably control temperature throughout the day and night. The bedroom could be kept at an ideal temperature, regardless of outdoor conditions. This eliminated many of the discomforts that had previously disrupted sleep. Excessive heat in summer, excessive cold in winter. Yet air conditioning created its own issues. Dry air could irritate the respiratory system. The hum of the machine could disturb some people. The artificial consistency of the indoor environment might disrupt the body's natural rhythms, which had previously been entrained to natural temperature fluctuations. For some people, air conditioning was essential for sleep. For others, it was an unwanted impediment. The post-World War II era saw the emergence of new appliances and technologies in the bedroom. Bedside lamps with different levels of brightness allowed for more precise control of the light environment. Electric blankets and heating pads offered precise temperature control. Some experimental sleepers used white noise machines to mask environmental sounds. Blackout curtains became increasingly available for those who wanted complete darkness. For night shift workers, who had to sleep during the day, these technologies became essential. Without blackout curtains, an electric light, or extra heating for comfort, the daytime bedroom would be bright and warm, conditions that were naturally conducive to wakefulness rather than sleep. The artificial creation of night conditions during the day required deliberate effort and technology. In the 1950s and 1960s, the culture around sleep began to shift in certain segments of society. The beat poets and their cultural heirs celebrated experiences of altered consciousness, sometimes including sleep deprivation. Rock and roll culture emphasized energy, excitement, and living intensely, values that were somewhat in tension with the quietness and passivity of sleep. For young people in particular, sleep was sometimes seen as lost time uitzonee, as a constraint that limited the intensity and quantity of life experience. This represented a significant departure from earlier cultural attitudes, in which sleep was respected as necessary and restorative. The shift reflected both the increased energy available through modern technology and electricity, and a change in cultural values toward activity and consumption as markers of a full life. Yet at the same time, the psychological and physical toll of sleep deprivation was becoming increasingly apparent. Workers were exhausted. Young people who embraced sleep deprivation found their performance suffered. The drive to sleep, the most fundamental biological drive, could not be indefinitely suppressed without consequences. As we move into the final portion of our exploration, we arrive at the contemporary world, a world of smartphones, the internet, and constant connectivity. If the 20th century began with the disruption caused by electricity and electric light, the 21st century has introduced new and more intimate disruptions to sleep through our personal devices. The screens of smartphones, tablets, and computers emit blue light, which is of a wavelength that suppresses melatonin production, the hormone that signals to the body that it is time to sleep. For people who check their phones or work on computers in the hours before bed, this blue light is interfering with their circadian rhythms in real time. The content of these screens, news, social media, work emails, and so forth, often provides stimulation and emotional engagement that naturally leads to wakefulness rather than drowsiness. Yet simultaneously, there is more public attention being paid to sleep than perhaps ever before. Sleep hygiene, a term that would have been unfamiliar to most people a few decades ago, is now widely discussed. Recommendations for better sleep are everywhere. Turn off devices before bed. Create a cool, dark room. Maintain a consistent sleep schedule. Avoid caffeine after a certain hour. The irony is that while information about how to sleep better is more abundant than ever, many people sleep worse than their ancestors did. The increased pace of life, the constant availability of work and communication, the difficulty of disengaging from information and obligation, all of these contribute to sleep problems. In contemporary research and clinical practice, sleep is understood as a complex physiological process involving multiple sleep stages, each with its own characteristics and functions. Slow-wave sleep, in which most of the brain's electrical activity is synchronized into slow rhythms, is understood to be particularly important for physical restoration. REM sleep, with its rapid eye movements and brain activity resembling wakefulness, is associated with dreaming and with memory consolidation and emotional processing. Yet despite this advanced understanding of the mechanism of sleep, many people continue to struggle with insomnia and sleep disorders. The causes are multifactorial and complex. Stress, anxiety, medical conditions, medication side effects, poor sleep hygiene, and the mismatch between modern life's demands and the human body's natural sleep needs. Contemporary bedtime routines among those seeking better sleep often include elements both ancient and modern. Prayer and meditation have seen a resurgence, not necessarily in a religious context, but as secular practices for calming the mind. Yoga and breathing exercises, drawn from traditions thousands of years old, but now repackaged in modern language, are recommended. Progressive muscle relaxation, in which one systematically tenses and then relaxes each muscle group, provides a way to release physical tension. Guided meditations, listened to on a smartphone ironically, help quiet the mind. At the same time, scientific approaches to sleep problems have also advanced. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, is now recognized as one of the most effective treatments for chronic insomnia, and it does not rely on medication. Instead, it addresses the behavioral and thought patterns that maintain insomnia. Sleep tracking apps and devices allow people to monitor their sleep and to see whether interventions are working. Some people have returned to more natural approaches to sleep, in part as a reaction against the medicalization of sleep and the side effects associated with sleeping pills. Herbal remedies that have been used for centuries, valerian, passionflower, chamomile, have been subjected to scientific study. While the evidence is mixed, some do show genuine benefit in promoting sleep or reducing the time it takes to fall asleep. For some people, the separation of the bedroom from the rest of life that is possible in modern architecture is beneficial. A room dedicated to sleep, with a good mattress and pillows, adequate climate control, and freedom from disruption, can provide the ideal conditions for rest. Yet for others, this isolation brings its own anxieties. Without the presence of others, without the ambient sounds and activities of a shared space, sleep becomes something to be achieved rather than something that naturally emerges from daily life. The contemporary sea world has also created entirely new categories of sleep disruption. Jet lag, caused by rapid transit across time zones, scrambles the body's circadian rhythm. Shift work, which is increasingly common in the modern economy, requires people to sleep at times when their bodies are signaling wakefulness. Light pollution and the constant availability of artificial light interfere with the natural circadian rhythm. Yet, there is also a growing recognition that sleep cannot be approached purely from an individual perspective, as if better sleep is simply a matter of better technique or better devices. Sleep is affected by work schedules, by economic pressures, by the culture that values productivity and activity over rest. The sociologist Roger Ekirch's research into segmented sleep in pre-industrial societies, for instance, has inspired some people to question whether continuous 8-hour sleep is actually natural or even optimal for humans. Perhaps the biphasic sleep pattern of earlier eras, which many find difficult and unnatural given modern work schedules, was actually well suited to human physiology. Contemporary discussions of sleep also increasingly address inequality. Those with the means can afford the best mattresses, the most comfortable pillows, a cool, quiet, private bedroom. Those without such resources may sleep on poor quality bedding in crowded, noisy, inadequately temperature-controlled spaces. Sleep quality, like so many aspects of life, is influenced by economic status. As we near the end of our exploration of the sleep, cross centuries, let us pause and reflect on what we have learned, and consider how the wisdom of the past might inform our contemporary approach to sleep and rest. From the ancient Egyptians, we have inherited the understanding that sleep requires intentional preparation and protection. They understood that approaching sleep requires a conscious shift in consciousness and a sense of intention. In our modern context, this might translate into creating bedtime rituals that signal to the body and mind that sleep is coming. Small ceremonies that transition us from the activity and light of day into the quietness and darkness of rest. From the Romans, we retain the understanding that balance is essential. The balance between activity and rest, between work and sleep, between mental stimulation and mental quietness. The Roman recognition that insomnia is a real problem, deserving of attention and solution, rather than something to be merely endured, is as relevant now as it was 2,000 years ago. From the medieval period, we can appreciate the spiritual dimension of sleep, not necessarily in a religious sense, but in the recognition that sleep involves a kind of surrender, a letting go of control and agency. The medieval person understood sleep as something that required faith and trust. In secular terms, this might be understood as the necessity of allowing the body to do what it naturally does, without obsessing over whether we're falling asleep correctly. From the early modern period, we derive the understanding that the mind can be deliberately calmed through certain practices. The Stoic techniques of meditation and reflection, the focus on a calming image or idea, these remain valid approaches to quieting an active mind. The recognition that anxiety about sleep is itself a cause of insomnia, expressed by 18th century physicians, is now validated by modern cognitive behavioral approaches to insomnia. From the Victorian era, we have the recognition that the sleep environment matters. A comfortable bed, appropriate temperature, protection from light and noise. These are not luxuries, but contributors to good sleep. The Victorian attention to the details of the bedroom as a space dedicated to rest and restoration remains relevant. And from the modern scientific understanding, we know that sleep is a complex physiological process with multiple stages and functions. We know that circadian rhythm matters, that light exposure affects melatonin production, that caffeine and other stimulants interfere with sleep, that regular sleep schedules help our bodies prepare for and achieve sleep. So what might a comprehensive, historically informed approach to sleep look like today? First, we might recognize that preparing for sleep is as much a necessity as actually sleeping. Rather than rushing directly from stimulating daytime activities into bed and expecting sleep to come automatically, we might create a transition period. This could include a warm bath or shower, a change into comfortable clothes, and a period of quieting activity. Second, we might establish bedtime rituals that have personal meaning. These might be secular or spiritual, but they should mark the transition into the sleep period as intentional and important. This could be a few minutes of meditation, a prayer, a moment of gratitude, reading a few pages of something beautiful or comforting, or simply sitting quietly in the darkness. Third, we might attend carefully to the sleep environment. The bedroom should be cool. Research suggests that a temperature around 65-68 degrees Fahrenheit is optimal for most people. It should be dark, as darkness is important for melatonin production. It should be quiet, or if quiet is not possible, white noise or nature sounds might mask disruptive noises. It should be comfortable, with quality bedding that feels good to the body. Fourth, we might approach artificial light with more intention. Rather than having bright lights on until the moment we get into bed, we might begin dimming lights in the evening, allowing our bodies to adjust gradually. We might use blue light filters on screens or avoid screens altogether in the hours before bed. We might use the dimmer switches that many modern lights are capable of. Fifth, we might reconsider the pressure to sleep continuously for 8 hours, and perhaps experiment with whether a different sleep schedule, including a brief rest period in the afternoon, might better suit our individual needs and circumstances. Sixth, we might be willing to use tools and remedies, both ancient and modern, to facilitate sleep, while recognizing that no single solution works for everyone. Some people benefit from herbal remedies like chamomile or valerian. Some benefit from medications. Some benefit from meditation or breathing exercises. Some benefit from journaling or other mind-clearing practices. The key is to find what works for you without obsessing over whether you're doing it correctly. Seventh, we might recognize that how we approach the day affects how we sleep at night. Exercise during the day, exposure to light in the morning and afternoon, managing stress and anxiety. All of these contribute to better sleep. Sleep is not an isolated activity, but part of a larger pattern of daily life. Finally, we might cultivate a sense of acceptance about sleep difficulties. The recognition that many people throughout history have struggled with sleep, that this is a deeply human challenge, that it often arises from anxiety and worry rather than from a genuine inability to sleep, might help us approach our own sleep difficulties with more compassion and less judgment. As our journey through the quiet hours comes to an end, perhaps we might take a moment to reflect more deeply on what sleep and rest mean, and what we might be losing as a society in our embrace of constant light, constant activity, and constant connectivity. Rest is not merely the absence of work. This is an important distinction that many modern people have lost sight of. In earlier centuries, when work was primarily manual and agricultural, rest was understood as a necessary physical recovery from exertion. Yet as work has become increasingly mental and abstract, rest has become more complex and multifaceted. Rest includes, certainly, the restorative sleep that allows the body to repair itself and the brain to consolidate memories and process emotions. But rest also includes downtime, leisure, periods of low-intensity activity or no activity at all. It includes time for reflection and meditation. It includes time simply for existing without producing or achieving. The modern world has become increasingly intolerant of such unproductive rest. We are expected to use our downtime productively, to exercise, to learn, to engage in hobbies that have concrete outcomes, to use technology to stay connected and informed. The idea of simply resting, of allowing one's mind to wander without purpose or goal, of sitting quietly without stimulation. This is increasingly rare and even viewed as laziness or failure. Yet there is something valuable, perhaps even necessary, in such purposeless rest. The brain, when left to its own devices, without external stimulation or imposed tasks, engages in what is called the default mode network. This is not idleness. Rather, it is a state in which the brain is making connections, processing experiences, and engaging in a kind of cognitive work that cannot happen when the mind is focused externally. Sleep, in particular, has become more precious and less reliable in the modern world precisely because it is so often neglected or disturbed. In cultures that have embraced the productivity ethic fully, places where sleep is seen as time wasted, where sleeping too much is viewed as a character flaw, where being constantly connected and available is a sign of commitment and capability, sleep problems are epidemic. Yet sleep cannot be rushed or forced. It cannot be made more efficient. It is, by its nature, a state of receptivity rather than activity, of surrender rather than control. This is what makes it so difficult to achieve in a world that valorizes activity and control. The darkness of night has for millennia been associated with both danger and rest. In dark, quiet places, humans have found both fear and peace. The medieval monastery's nighttime darkness was frightening, but also sacred. The Victorian bedroom's darkness, created by heavy curtains, was both a retreat from the stimulation of the outside world and a potential source of anxiety about what might lurk unseen. In our current world of constant artificial light, we have largely eliminated the experience of real darkness. Even in bedrooms with blackout curtains, the ambient light from the outside world, street lamps, signs, the light pollution from the city, maintains a subtle illumination. Few people in urban areas have experienced truly complete darkness since childhood. This loss of darkness may be more significant than we realize. The circadian rhythm, the roughly 24-hour cycle that governs sleep-wake cycles and many other biological functions, is entrained to light and dark. Artificial light, particularly at night, disrupts this rhythm. Moreover, there is something about complete darkness that seems to facilitate a particular kind of rest, a kind of dissolution of the boundaries of the self into the larger world. Consider the experience of sleeping in a completely dark room. One where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. There is a particular quality to such darkness. It is not frightening to everyone, and indeed many find it calming and conducive to deep sleep. When the visual sense is completely deprived of input, the other senses and the internal experience become more prominent. One becomes more aware of bodily sensations, of breathing, of thoughts and emotions arising and passing away. This is perhaps why so many meditative and spiritual traditions have involved darkness and closed eyes. The removal of visual input seems to facilitate a different mode of consciousness, one that is more internally focused, more receptive, and less subject to the constant stream of external stimulation that characterizes modern life. Our ancestors, sleeping in darkness lit perhaps by a small candle or fire, experienced regularly this kind of darkness. For them, the night was not merely a time of reduced illumination, but a genuinely different kind of environment. The fears associated with this darkness were real and profound. The possibility of predators, of accidents, of spiritual danger. Yet the darkness also provided a kind of sanctuary, a space where the rules of daylight life were suspended, where a different mode of being was possible. In restoring better sleep to our contemporary lives, perhaps we need to restore more darkness. Not the darkness of fear or danger, but the darkness of calm and rest. This might mean more aggressive use of blackout curtains, more willingness to sleep in complete darkness. Perhaps even the practice of meditating in complete darkness for brief periods, allowing the mind to experience the particular state of consciousness that darkness can facilitate. We have traveled together through 3,000 years of sleep, from ancient Egypt to the present day. We have witnessed how societies, with vastly different technologies and beliefs, have nonetheless grappled with the same basic human need: to transition from wakefulness to sleep, to find rest and restoration in the darkness, to prepare the mind and body for the vulnerable state of sleeping. What emerges from this history is not a single universal truth about sleep, but rather a recognition that sleep is fundamentally human. It involves not just biology, but also psychology, emotion, culture, and spirituality. What helps one person sleep might be entirely ineffective or even harmful for another. What was accepted practice in one era might be viewed as barbaric in another. Yet certain themes recur across time and culture: the importance of ritual and intention, the necessity of a safe, comfortable environment, the need to quiet the mind and shift consciousness, the vulnerability and trust involved in surrendering to sleep, the profound significance of the night and darkness. The modern person, equipped with all our scientific knowledge and technological advantages, is not necessarily closer to good sleep than our ancestors. In some ways, we are further from it. We have eliminated the natural rhythm that once governed sleep. We have created an environment of constant stimulation and endless availability. We have developed the capacity to remain awake far longer than is healthy, and we have cultivated a culture that often values such wakefulness. Yet this history also provides hope and guidance. The rituals that earlier peoples developed, warming milk, herbal infusions, prayer and meditation, the creation of a dedicated space for sleep. These are not superstitions to be abandoned, but genuine practices that address real human needs. The understanding that approaching sleep requires intention and preparation is as valid now as it was in ancient Egypt. In the quiet hours before sleep, as you lie in the darkness of your bedroom, you are connecting with a practice that extends back through all of human history. You are engaging in an experience that your ancestors knew, that people across the globe know, that humans in centuries to come will know. This is something profound and worthy of respect. To sleep well is not a luxury or an indulgence. It is a necessity. It is a fundamental human right that often goes unrecognized and unfulfilled. Yet it is also an opportunity to rest, to restore, to process experience, to surrender to something larger than the individual will and ego. As you close your eyes tonight, you might carry with you the knowledge of all these centuries of human beings doing what you are doing. The Egyptians invoking divine protection, the Romans seeking balance and harmony, the medieval monks rising for night prayer, the Victorian gentleman settling into his elaborately appointed bed, the modern person grateful for electricity and comfort, all of us seeking the same thing, the peace and restoration that only sleep can bring. The quiet hours are not empty time. They are not lost time or wasted time. They are time in which the crucial work of rest and restoration happens. They are time in which we are truly ourselves, freed from the performance and effort of daytime. They are time in which we surrender to something deeper than consciousness, something that connects us to all of humanity across time. As you drift into sleep, the world of history and wakefulness gradually recedes. Your breathing deepens, your muscles relax. Your mind, which has been engaged with the events and concerns of the day, begins to disengage, to shift toward the dream world that awaits. The boundary between wakefulness and sleep grows thinner, and you cross over into rest. And in that rest, you find what humans have always sought in sleep: peace, safety, restoration, and the renewal that comes from surrendering for a time to the quiet and the darkness. Sleep well. May your night be restful and restorative. May you wake refreshed and at peace. And may you carry forward into the next day some of the calm and wisdom that the quiet hours have given you.